on something and they'd lose, and they didn't have any money anyway. And then they'd always say, well, double or nothing. Well, they didn't have double either. So basically, the devil's saying double or nothing in this, because he lost there in the first chapter. So, but throughout, the devil doesn't believe that anyone serves God because of a love of God, and without some selfish interest. And so, again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. And I just don't want to devolve. I think a lot about exactly who or what was Satan. I have some opinions, but they're just opinions. I don't think you can prove anything. Obviously, he's a created being. What sort of being is sort of hard to say. Yes. I think he should. The Lord has not made a secret of it. Yeah. Well, some people, I think there's a lot of people who believe that there is a hell, but they don't care. They're going to still misbehave. The Lord said unto Satan, from whence comest thou? And Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro in the earth and from walking up and down in it. You know, it's kind of interesting. In Peter talks about the devil as a roaring lion. I believe that's in the 5th chapter. Seeketh whom he may devour. And this statement's been made in chapter 1 and verse 7 and here. And when Peter says of Satan, he's a roaring lion walking about, seeking whom he may devour, the Greek verb that he uses is the one from which we get the word peripatetic. I'm sure you use that every day in conversation. But it means, if you've seen people who just can't rest, can't sit down, they're just wandering around. My grandmother always referred to such people as, she was the kind of woman who just runs up and down the road all the time. Wasn't content to just be at home and into home things, but always had to be out shopping and running here and there. Peripatetic. But that's the word. You didn't need to know that. Anyway, I'm not going to discuss with you. There's no point in discussing, as far as I can tell, what happened to Satan. I know a lot of people think he was a fallen angel, but the Lord discusses the fallen angels and says that they are reserved in chains of darkness, and the devil is definitely not reserved in chains of darkness. So, the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job? And here, I always appreciate the Lord. The Lord has a sense of humor, I think. You remember the first chapter where Satan has wiped out his children, his flocks, his herds, his home, and everything. And so here Satan comes back in, and the Lord says the same thing he says to him exactly in the first chapter. Have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him in all the earth. He's already said this to him once. In other words, he's saying, well, wrong again, weren't we, Satan? A perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and hateth evil. And still he holdeth fast his integrity, although thou movest me against him to destroy him without cause. So, Satan takes the jibe and jest and doubles down. He says, skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath will he give for his life. He says, Lord, you protected everything. You let me have everything about him except his physical health. And he says, but put forth thine hand now, and touch his bone and his flesh, and he'll curse thee to thy face. Now, this says to us a whole lot of things about the devil. The devil doesn't care about us. He's not trying to help anybody out. You and I are not, and I try to get this across. For instance, when you study the New Testament in Matthew about the temptation of Jesus, the point you've got to get across is the devil isn't, he's using us as pawns in his warfare with God. And so he doesn't care about Job. Doesn't care at all. Doesn't care whether Job serves him or doesn't serve him. But he wants to use him as a pawn to argue with God. Just as in the New Testament, he is willing to give all of us up. You remember where he says he showed Jesus all the kingdoms of the earth? And that's not the physical property, that's us. And he says, I'll give you all of them. Just bow down and worship. He was willing to give every last one of us up if we would just, if Jesus would just acknowledge him. He would accomplish his goal. He'll give you everything. This is what you came for. I'll give you all these people. Just bow down and worship me. So basically, it's the same thing here. He says, he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, behold, he is in thy hand. But save his life. He couldn't kill him, but Job was going to wish he would kill. So, let me just say a couple of things about this. God's faithfulness shows in this. He would not, we've said over and over again that God, 1 Corinthians says God will not allow you to be tempted above that you're able. But will with the temptation to make a way of escape. And so the devil is limited. In each of these conversations, there's a limit on what the devil can do. He cannot do more than God allows him to do, and God will always preserve us and continue us. 2 Timothy, the 2nd chapter, and verse 13 says, if we believe not, yet he abideth faithful. He cannot deny himself. God was faithful in all of this. He said, you can do anything to him, but you can't take his life. So that there was, this is interesting, God cares more about Job and his life than Job does. You're going to see that in the 3rd chapter. Job's ready to die. He wants to die. But God cared more about it than Job did. He would not allow Satan to take his life. So went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord, and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to his crown. This has been suggested by some people who look at it as a case of elephantiasis, which is basically an extreme form of leprosy. The skin becomes clotted and hard like an elephant's, and it has painful cracks and sores underneath the skin. It's a very painful thing. The boils are bad enough, but it may have been a little bit more than boils without necessarily the technical name. And he took him a potsherd, in other words, a piece of pottery, to scrape himself withal. And he sat down among the ashes. Now the ashes probably would have stung. He was scraping the ashes into his cuts, the scrapings that he's making. Where one pain is used to offset another pain. Then in verse 9, and we talked about this a little bit last week, then said his wife unto him, dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and die. And I talked to you about this last week. The word curse is used in the First chapter, the devil says if you afflict him, he'll curse you. Well, the word is actually bless in the Hebrew, but it's a word that is used just as, for instance, and I used this illustration last week, in an old illustration, that somebody would say he blessed him out. Well, that doesn't mean he said, what a wonderful person you are. It means he cursed him. And so it's a use of the passage in or the word in an obvious fashion, or in an opposite fashion. So the Douay-Rheims, I think Young's literal translation, will say, and I've seen a lot of writings, books written and so forth, about what a wonderful woman Job's wife was. She wanted him to bless God and die. But the same words used in the first chapter, it's used in this chapter. For instance, verse 5. Put forth thine hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face. I don't think it really means bless in the sense that Job, he intended for Job to bless God. It's used in that opposite sense. And most of the time that word's used I think I saw about 10, 12 times in the Bible. It's used in that opposite sense most of the time, and is reflected that way by the translators. The Lord says in Matthew 10 and verse 36, a man's foes shall be they of his own household. Sometimes the biggest discouragement we have in serving the Lord is our own family. I can't tell you how many times we've had someone here in the services who was a member of the church and their mate wasn't, and they just gradually got drugged down by the discouragement of the mate, fussing about going to church and ridiculing them. I remember one young man we had worshiping here for a while who had lived a pretty healthy life, nightlife, before coming, going out to the bars and dancing and dining all the time. And his wife liked that. That was what she liked. That was the lifestyle she wanted. So when he became a Christian and quit that, she was not happy. Things were not pleasant at home at all. And gradually, over time, she drug him away from the Lord, griping and complaining, and he gave in. Micah 7 and verse 6, same sort of idea. The son dishonoreth the father, the daughter riseth up against her mother, the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own house. Which may be what Matthew 10 and verse 36 is referring to. Sure. Yeah. I don't know. We all are going to die of something. I can't see how Satan would be helped in taking a life. Because if a man's faithful up to death, how has Satan benefited by taking his life? So I don't know. The point of this, I like to see, is that God has limited what Satan can do, and speaks of it in the New Testament. He won't suffer you to be tempted above what you're able. So there's a limit to what Satan can do to us. The limit in 1 Corinthians. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 10. He says, verse 12, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. there hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. In other words, other people have been tempted in this fashion and have succeeded in overcoming it. It's not such an overwhelming temptation that everybody gives in to it. So God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it. Now that doesn't always mean that He's going to remove the temptation, but He's going to make a way to escape it, that is, to bear it, to endure it. And the same sort of thing in 2 Corinthians, the 12th chapter. Paul says here, as he speaks of his thorn in the flesh, he says in verse 7, lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelation, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan, to buffet, lest I should be exalted above measure. He says that God gave him, or God allowed Satan to give him this thorn in the flesh, and we've argued from time to time, or thought from time to time, what that might have been. But he says, for this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And here's the way of escape. He didn't say, hey, you can get out of this thorn in the flesh. But the Lord said to him, my grace is sufficient for thee. Other people have had this thorn in the flesh. It's common to man. My strength is made perfect in weakness. That you don't understand the reality of the suffering you're going through. He says, I can use this suffering to strengthen you, to steel you, and to as an example to other people. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. And I think I commented about that in the case of Job last week, that if Job's suffering had not been so extreme, how much example would it have been? You know, if he said, whoo-wee, I got a really bad hangnail, or as a niece has just gone through, knee surgery. I'm pointing at Rebecca. A niece isn't back there. I thought I saw a fan look back to see a niece. You know, if it was just a knee surgery, you know, everybody go, well, I'm sorry Satan did that to you, but, you know, there's 3 or 4 others here in the crowd who've had knee surgery and they survived it and got along all right. There's a tremendous example in this suffering that Job went through. Now you see the same thing. The Lord does it over and over again. You see the same thing in Paul. That's what he's talking about here. He says, my strength is made perfect in weakness. You see it in Christ. Christ who's suffered for us. That's why we remember him. We remember the sacrifice. This do in remembrance of me. We try to remember it every Lord's Day because the suffering was so real and so undeserved. Job's suffering was undeserved as well. Oh, I had a passage I wanted to... And somebody pray for a ready recollection quick, because it's gone from me. Oh. Thank you. You prayed just in time. Let me see. There you go. Well, it could have been that too. Where is it? You know, he does it over and over. He says, yeah. Look in 1 Peter 4. For as much then as Christ hath suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. He that hath suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lust of men. What do you think baptism is trying to teach you. Baptism is an immersion into the suffering and death of Jesus. And your suffering in life that you bear peacefully and faithfully is an example. It's how He's making something worthwhile out of you and how you're teaching other people the strength of faith in the Lord. So you can see the same thing in several passages here. He says, look in verse 12. He says, "Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial, which is to try you as though some strange thing happened unto you." Remember that? Back over in Corinthians? It won't allow you, the temptations that are going to happen to you are common to man. Here, the fiery trial is not some strange thing. It's happened to others, they survived it. "But rejoice inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings, that when His glory shall be revealed, ye may be glad also with exceeding joy. If ye be reproached for the name of Christ, happy are ye, for the Spirit of glory and of God resteth upon you. On their part He is evil spoken of, but on your part He is glorified. Let none of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, as a busybody in other men's matters. Yet if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on this behalf." This is the lesson of suffering. So, yes, the devil still thinks he can afflict us with suffering and that we'll give up. He doesn't want God to build a hedge around us. So, Job responds to his wife. He said unto her, "Thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Job was saying that there is a sort of compensation. As surely as we receive good, there's a compensation. The good is there to compensate us for the evil that happens to us in life. There's an even-handedness to justice. There's a tremendous comparison and contrast between the temptation of Job and the temptation of Christ. And you know what, I'm not going to go through Gethsemane with you, but you know what the Lord prayed in Gethsemane and the suffering that He went through there. Hebrews 5 and verse 8 says, "Though He were a son, yet learned He obedience by the things which He suffered." Now, every one of us as Christians is going to suffer at some point, in some way. We're going to lose people we love. Our health is going to fail. Our businesses may fail. We may lose our jobs, and so forth. We may lose children. And how will we come through it? Those things commonly happen to man. And others have met those trials and come through them stronger and more faithful and realized that God was working through them even in that suffering. God was making something good out of us. It was the trial of our faith, which He... I'll get to reading too many passages to you. I'm sorry. I really didn't plan on this, but plan on reading you all these passages, but you ought to. I'm sure you're familiar with them. Both James and Peter start off talking about this sort of thing. Where is it? Yeah, James 1 and verse 12. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. And then Peter, very similarly in 1 Peter 1, he says in verse 6, he says, if need be, now for a season, if need be, ye are in heaviness through manifold temptations, the trial of your faith being much more precious than of a gold that perisheth, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. And you have a very similar statement back in James. I just can't see it right now. Well, I'm not going to. You can find it. Yeah. In James 1 and verse 2. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. And that seems to be the lesson that is pointed to in the Scriptures about Job. For instance, in James 5 and verse 10, take, my brethren, the prophets who have spoken in the name of the Lord for an example of suffering, affliction, and of patience. Behold, we count them happy which endure. You have heard of the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. So, the point of this is that the suffering Job's enduring is making him stronger and better. And he comes to realize that through this process, that there's a reason for suffering. There's a reason for the difficulties we endure. So, when Job's 3 friends heard of all the evil that was come upon him, they came every one from his own place: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite. For they had made an appointment together to come to mourn with him and to comfort him. I think I talked in somewhere in the introductions about these 3 men that they probably were Saudi Arabian a little bit, maybe from that area, as we tried to identify the area where the book of Job was written, or takes place. It says, when they lifted up their eyes afar off and knew him not, they lifted up their voice and wept. You know, I thought of this passage the other day. You know, I know Larry Curry has been so sick, and for three months, and saw a picture of him as he was leaving the hospital finally, and he just didn't look like the same man. I had to look closely. He had aged. He had lost a lot of weight. I'm sure maybe with enough donuts and pancakes he'll get back his appearance. But they didn't recognize Job. There's others here more close to us that I think you know the same thing. Your sons and husbands and daughters. You know, and I told my wife the other day, age is doing strange things to me. I told her, you know, Gloria, I look in the mirror and I don't recognize myself. The image I have in my mind, you know, the Bible talks about this. The man who looks in the mirror and goeth his way and straightway forgetteth what manner of person he is. But I don't recognize myself. Somehow there's an old man looking back at me, and I don't know who that is. But we've seen our friends and relatives and sons and daughters and husbands and wives grow ill and waste away. And I think of my mother. I remember my mother when I was young and other people speaking to me and telling me how beautiful she was. And she was a beautiful woman. And you look at her in old age and that's gone. That's gone. Just like it's going to be gone with me. And so they didn't recognize him. They lifted up their voice and wept. These were good friends of his. And they rent everyone his mantle. It was so terrible. They just couldn't stand it. And sprinkled dust upon their heads toward heaven. So they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And none spake a word unto him. For they saw that his grief was very great. 7 days. They just sat there and looked at him. And nobody spoke. Sometimes people say to me, going to a funeral or going to the hospital, I always love taking my wife with me to the hospital. Because my wife is a talker. My goodness. You just sort of throw her in the door and turn her loose, and she'll just talk up a storm. And I'm not. And I've had people ask me, say, well, at a funeral, what do you, I don't know what to say. Well, there isn't anything to say. I'm sorry. It's about the best you can do. And there, you can't say a lot more. They couldn't say anything. It was awful. It was absolutely awful to see this man. And Eliphaz in chapter 4, which I thought we were going to get to tonight, but I talked too much. Eliphaz, apparently Job was the greatest man of his generation. Wealth, enormous wisdom, prosperity, a brilliant man. And Eliphaz talks about it. He had been an advisor to so many people. And now, he's not recognizable. That's all gone. The wealth is gone, the health is gone, and he's in despair. And so they just sat there on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. Well, we've got time. Let's see if we can start the 3rd chapter in Job's speech. It is interesting. I'm going to read the first few verses here. And I don't really know much to comment about this. Most of this book is very understandable. There's not a lot of mysteries in it. So after this, Job opened his mouth and cursed his day. In other words, he cursed the day he was born. And that's not a sin. Job spake and said, let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, there is a man-child conceived. Let that day be darkness. Let not God regard it from above, neither let the light shine upon it. Let darkness and the shadow of death stain it. Let a cloud dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That seems to refer to okay. Boy, I'm getting old. Eclipse. As for that night, let darkness seize it, and let it not be joined unto the days of the year. Say, just take that day out of the calendar. Let it not come into the number of the months. Now, it's interesting that in Jeremiah 20, this section is quoted almost precisely. Jeremiah 20:14, cursed be the day wherein I was born. Let not the day wherein my mother bare me be blessed. Cursed be the man who brought tidings to my father, saying, a child, man-child, is born unto thee, making him very glad. And let that man be as the cities which the Lord overthrew, Sodom and Gomorrah, and repented not. Let him hear the cry in the morning and the shouting at noontide. Because he slew me not from the womb, or that my mother might have been my grave, and her womb to be always great with me. I don't know why. There's some argument as to who wrote it first, but personally, I believe Jeremiah is quoting Job, because this speech in Job is central to the book of Job, whereas in Jeremiah it is not central. It appears there just a quotation, and the rest of Jeremiah is on different subjects and so forth. So I would assume that this is original with Job and being quoted in Jeremiah. Where did I get to? Verse 7. Let that night be solitary. Let no joyful voice come therein. Let them curse it that curse the day, who are ready to raise up their mourning. It says, basically, let those who proclaim days unlucky or accursed curse that day as primarily the worst day to curse. That's sort of like Mondays. Nobody likes Monday. That's the day we have to go to work. So he says, make it the worst Monday. Make it the worst day of the year. It should be the sample of the ultimate curse, the day Job was born. Now, I want to look at the NIV. You can look at most translations. May those who curse days curse that day. Those who are, this is the NIV, those who are ready to rouse Leviathan. This is probably a reference to the crocodile. That is, people who are as crazy as the ones who try to get the crocodile roused up. That hopeless and reckless nature of mankind is the absolute ultimate that he refers to here. See, may those who curse days curse that day like somebody who was wrestling a crocodile. Anyway. May its morning stars become dark, and may it wait for daylight in vain and not see the first rays of dawn. Actually, that's kind of a poetic, as I said, this is a poem. The actual reading of that is the eyelids of dawn. May it never dawn on that day. For it did, because that day did not shut the doors of the womb on me to hide trouble from my eyes. Why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me and breasts that I might be nursed? Let me switch back to King James. King James uses the word prevent. Why did the knees prevent me? But it's basically being dandled on your mother's knees. I said, why? Why were there knees to receive me? Why would I give suck? Now should I have lain still and been quiet? I should have slept. Then I had been at rest. He wishes he had been stillborn. With kings and counselors of the earth who built desolate places for themselves, or with princes that had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Says, I wish I'd been dead, then I could have been with those guys. This, by the way, might be this. They built desolate places. The King James says, let me see, the NIV says, They built themselves places now lying in ruins, that may be a reference to the pyramids, where kings built themselves desolate places for their tombs. Anyway, it's an interesting thought. Verse 16, why was I not hidden away in the ground like a stillborn child, like an infant who never saw the light of day? There the wicked cease from turmoil, and there their weary are at rest. Captives also enjoy their ease. They no longer hear the slave drivers shout. The small and the great are there, and the slaves are freed from their owners. Great relief to die, apparently. Why is light given to those in misery, and life to the bitter of soul? Why? Why does the day dawn on people in misery? To those who long for death that does not come, who search for it more than for hidden treasure. They want to die. Some of you may have close experience with this. To those who long for death that does not come, certainly, who are filled with gladness and rejoice when they reach the grave. Why is life given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? Job 1 and verse 10 uses that same hedge illustration. But God has surrounded me with suffering. For sighing has become my daily food. My groans pour out like water. This is interesting, this verse 25. What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. You know, this tells us that Job had always had a remembrance of the uncertainty and instability of life. You know, we think about our wonderful blessings, but back in the back of our mind, there is that fear. We know we could lose it all. We know that our health could fail. We know that someone in our family could get sick and die. We know that. So he says, what I greatly feared has come upon me. He had been overtaken by a calamity that had mocked his carefulness and was far beyond his expectations. Do any of you have that expectation that, yes, we know we'll be sick, but we'll just die peacefully in our bed? And it doesn't happen that way. The pain exceeds our expectation. So he closes out his speech in verse 26. I have no peace, no quietness, I have no rest, but only turmoil. Try to remember, in all this, Job sinned not. You can be in despair. You can wish for death. You can question why you're going through this, and it's not sinful. Job's going to come up with some answers, and they're not the answers his friends came up with, but you might think about it. Thank you.